introduce myself a little bit more because it has been a long time since I've been in Regina, spoken in Regina. I am known as a woman of three passions. My first passion and let me explain that a passion is, I'm talking about something that means more to me than anything else. It's really what gets me up in the morning. My first passion is the millions in our world who, through no fault of their own, have never heard of Jesus. In mission circles, we refer to them as unreached people. I'm passionate about unreached people groups. And lest I be accused of using churchese, that's an interesting language, isn't it, in today's world. Let me just define for you what an unreached people group is. We're not talking about nation states or countries. We're talking about ethnic groups. And an unreached people group is a group of people in whom less than 2% are followers of Jesus. And the sad truth is that without help from the outside, there probably is little chance that a church will be established. They need help from the outside. We are that help in the Alliance Canada, in several places in our world. I am so thankful to be part of a church family, the Alliance, that has prioritized unreached people groups. In a day when our resources are few, and people resource and financial resources are fewer, I love the fact that the Alliance is prioritizing those who've never had a chance yet to hear. Which leads me then to talk about my second passion, the millions in our world who suffer intensely today because they are willing to be known as followers of Jesus. So I love the persecuted church. I love the church that suffers. I'm going to tell you some of my story, my experiences with the underground church around the world. I think this passion was injected into my veins by my parents. I was born in southern China as the regime of Mao Zedong came to power in 1949, and for the first few years of my life, our family were house prisoners in southern China. And then in 1951, Mao Zedong issued an edict that ordered all missionaries to leave the country. And in a single day, 1,000 missionaries left southern China. And my family was among them. We went down to the closest intersection of roads. I was a babe in my mother's arms. She had 2 toddlers, can you imagine? And we literally hitchhiked our way across southern China to freedom. Arrived in Canada several months later as refugees, which explains why I have such a passion for refugees and immigrants who come to our country in these days. The church in China entered an era of unprecedented suffering that continues to this day. My father could never speak about the church we left behind in China without weeping. And so I grew up with this passion for the millions in our world who suffer intensely today because they are willing to follow Jesus. And in the providence of God, as a young woman, God allowed me to go back to countries where the church had been driven underground. That's why we call it the underground church. People who haven't been in our churches very much don't understand that language. Yes, there are churches on the street corner in places like China and in communist countries today, but the real life of the church is what is happening in the underground. And yes, you might be saying, well, that was 40 years ago when you went to communist Europe. But I want to say that as I work with new international workers who are feeling the call of God, I'm realizing that the issues I dealt with in those days are the same issues that new recruits are dealing with today. A handful of you knew me in those days, And I can remember coming to Regina and speaking on home assignments and telling stories, and I've run into a few people already in Regina who remember me from those days. Amazing. They were children then, they're now in their middle or later middle adult years, and I can always tell who they are when they run up to me and they say, "Oh, I remember your stories. I remember your stories so well. Have you written them in a book? I want to tell them to my children." And the answer for them is what I'm going to tell you this morning, that yes, I have written a book, and I have it here with me today. I'd be very delighted if you would purchase one this morning. The book is about those years that I spent in the countries of Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, working with an underground seminary. It was the only way the underground church leadership could get training in those days. And I have written that story in this book. In a sense, it's written for Alliance congregations because, as I said to a prayer group already this morning, the prayers of God's people in Alliance churches across the country was the wind beneath my sails in those years. Oh, there's so many stories I could tell you. The Romanian church today has a lot to teach us about what the future of the suffering church is going to look like. In those days when I was there, which was the 80s and into the 90s, the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu made life very difficult for those who followed Jesus. They were, the 80s in Romania, they were the most difficult years for the Romanian church. While I was writing this book, I had the privilege to go back to Romania twice and do research, talking with lots of the pastors, talking with my former students. And I guess I kind of needed some validation that what I was remembering about those years, now 40 years ago, that my memories were really correct. And as I sat with many of the pastors, I could tell you so many stories. As the pastors said to me, "Miriam, what you remember was true. In fact, you don't know the half." And they would tell me stories that were amazing about how after I would leave their town, the secret police would come to the door, that dreaded knock at the door, and take them away for interrogation, trying to get out of them the name of this visitor from the West that had snuck into their town. I tell people Romania was a hard place. And in fact, the people whom God is raising up today to go into cross-culturally are going to hard places. I say this with all the compassion of my heart, that the easy places in our world have been reached. That is not to in any way diminish the sacrifice that many of our heroes of the faith gave in going overseas. Not in any way. But I do know that the years before us, as God takes, I wish I had time to tell you about the new work that the Alliance is launching. I almost don't dare name the country because the persecution is so intense. Going into the great subcontinent, you know what I'm talking about, in Southeast Asia. And it's going to be a hard place for the next generation to reach. My third passion, and I pray that it involves some of you. My third passion in life is the next generation. As I journeyed across Canada, and now I'm coming back, heading home next week after the Engage weekend at Living Hope this next weekend. And they told me to invite you if you want to get some fresh information about our international workers next weekend. But I'm focusing on this tour of 2.5 months on asking God to raise up the next generation. Who, as a retired international worker, I'm always asking God, who is going to replace people like me and my brother Larry Charter and Don and Betty Orr and Sheila Carr and so many others that you know and have prayed for? Who is going to take the gospel to the ends of the earth in the next generation? Some of you sitting here this morning, listening to my message, perhaps one or two of you will hear the voice of God. And there may be others of you. I already met for prayer with a group that I sensed in my heart may have the same calling I have, which is to be advocates for the next generation. That's my role in retirement, advocates for those whom God is going to raise up. I'm not just talking this morning about millennials who might hear the voice of God, the tap on the shoulder. I'm not just talking about that generation, but I think that the next wave of witnesses will include professionals who in midlife, maybe they can retire early and sense that they have some mileage left in them. One of my passions, this third passion, is the next generation in the church whom the church is going to send into the world. And one of the things I love to do more than anything else is to speak into the lives of those people who are hearing the voice of God in these days. Let me tell you a very quick story about where this passion of mine was birthed, this passion for the next generation, because it involves the story of a church. And I hope you can make the transfer from my home church, which was Foothills Alliance Church in Calgary, to this church. In 1971, I was just arriving in Calgary from small town Alberta. I had come to the big city to go to University of Calgary, and I wanted to find a church. First Sunday, I walked through the doors of Foothills Alliance Church. That's more than 50 years ago. And I often tell people I have never left. Although God's will for my life has taken me around the world, I've been gone most of the last 50 years, but Foothills has been where I've been rooted. This story that I'm going to tell you, there's sort of passing of faith at two different levels. There's passing of faith at the church level, and then there's passing of faith at the personal level as well. I tell the story of the impact of Foothills Alliance Church. I write it in my book because it is so foundational to what I think God is going to do through the church in the next generation. So I walked through the door, first Sunday of September 1971, and I was so warmly greeted as a university student. And the pastor, Gordon Fowler, made it very clear to all of us in the college and career, you're not just here to receive, we expect you to give as well. And so I got involved in that church. I hadn't been raised in a church where I was invited into the ministry of the church. I basically had spent my growing up years sitting in the pew watching the people on the platform do church. And during those years in university, those 4 years, I fell in love with church. I was involved in the college group. I taught Sunday school to grade 5 girls. I was a part of the worship. At that time, we had choirs, and I played piano and organ. I was so involved. I loved that church. 4 years passed. I got a job teaching French in the Calgary School Board and was beginning to feel that sense of, wow, now I can maybe get ahead in life. And yet there was this sense deep within me that God had created me for something else. But I wasn't sure what it was. Jump ahead to 1978. So now I had been at that church for 7 years. And one morning I arrived at the back door of the church to come in, and the chairman of the elder board met me at the door, and he said, Miriam, the elders would like to meet with you after church. Of course, my first thought was, what have I done wrong that the elders would want to meet with me? After most people had left from the church, the elders gathered around me in the lobby of the church, and the chairperson said to me, are you going to teach French the rest of your life? And I was so taken aback. He said, we have seen gifts for ministry in your life. We've watched you for the last 7 years, and we are wondering if you shouldn't be pursuing the idea of going into ministry. I was stunned. In fact, this man said, We so believe what we're telling you that if God should call you to go to Canadian Theological Seminary, we will pay your way. They said, if you go to CTS in Regina and discern that this is God's will, it's our gift to you. If you discern that it is not God's will, then we will consider it an interest-free loan. Can you imagine the impact on a young person of hearing the leadership of the church affirming the spiritual gifts that they have seen in your life? It was mind-boggling to me. That's the best illustration I can give you of passing faith at the level of the church. Let me talk for a little bit about passing faith at the personal level. I have with me here this morning a battered old book that's more than 100 years old. It's very, very, should I be adjusting something? It's a very, very old book. And I treasure it. It is indeed a family treasure. It's a story out of China about the bloody revolt historians call the Boxer Rebellion of 1901, in which the Manchu dynasty in China was overthrown. So the Chinese forces were fighting Western powers. This will make it a little easier. This will make it a little easier for you to listen to me. So the Chinese forces were fighting Western powers, and the Japanese, many on both sides of the conflict, were dying. And as I got to chapter 17 in this book, it tells the story of an English doctor who was caring for the wounded Chinese soldiers. You heard me right. He was caring for the wounded on the side of the Chinese army. As I read that story, it took me back to my childhood here in Canada, because on a hot summer afternoon in a small town in Alberta, my father would take his little children for a walk, usually along an abandoned railway track outside of town. And as we walked, I heard his stories of childhood in China. Because his father, my grandfather George Charter, was the English doctor that this book talks about. My earthly father died nearly 50 years ago. He died prematurely at 60 years of age. But he lives on in the present generation. At his funeral, there was not much talk about how much he was worth, because he hardly had any money to leave for his children. In fact, he didn't leave them any inheritance at all. But someone has said that an inheritance is what you leave for someone. A legacy is what you leave in someone. My father and mother left a legacy of spiritual and moral currency that will be felt for generations to come, because they invested in their children. And I want to talk for a few minutes about that legacy. The book that I have written, it's called Regeneration, talking about the renewal of generation, from generation to generation. And of course, it's rooted, I'm telling stories out of communist Romania. And I say, if they could do it in communist Europe, we can do it here in Canada. Some of those best years of my life were spent as an Alliance International worker in Romania. And my book is a book of stories about how followers of Jesus, yes, they were forced underground, but where the real life of the church was. The church met in secret. We were all trying to fly under the radar of the secret police. Bible colleges and seminaries were closed. And there were so few pastors in those days. Some men pastored 10 or 12 churches. Often to control their ministry, the government would cut off their gas rations so they couldn't get to the next church. And in those years, those were the 1980s, Western missionaries like myself traveled by train from Vienna, Austria, and we met in secret places with the pastors, often at great risk to themselves and some risk to ourselves as well. Because if our secret meetings had been detected, those pastors would have been arrested and possibly imprisoned. Our teaching materials, even the Bibles from which we taught in the seminary, the underground seminary, were smuggled in by people like Brother Andrew's group out of Open Doors. We had to find creative ways to get across the border into Romania. My cover was to go in as a travel agent from Calgary, looking for places where adventure seekers might go to ski. I mean, what a joke in communist Europe to be looking for. But somehow that story was believed by those men and women who were the border guards in those days. I traveled in old, worn-out clothes so that the secret police wouldn't recognize me as a tourist. When I arrived in a town, I didn't just come out of the train and try to find where the Christians were gathering. No. That would have been far too dangerous for the believers in that town. I would stand in the train station knowing that the secret police were in that massive crowd, and the secret police were looking at each person coming out of the train, determined to snare any Western tourists, travelers who might be coming, knowing they were probably coming to meet with Christians, that hated part of society. I would scan the crowd myself. I was dressed like a peasant. No one would have recognized me. I looked always, our sign was for a tall man carrying a small child, and in the arms of that child, or he was carrying in his arms his child, and the little child was holding a little yellow rubber duck. Instantly I knew that was the man to follow. He would turn around and lead me out of the station, down the street. We would go around the block a few times till he was quite certain that the secret police weren't following us. And then, when he felt all was clear, we would dart down a back alley, and he would lead me to the place where believers were meeting under cover of darkness. And for 6 or 8 hours that night, I would teach a small group of believers how to share faith, how to disciple new Christians. Yes, that was 40, 50 years ago. But I say to you this morning that much of the Church of Jesus Christ around the world, in places like North Korea, North Africa, India, and yes, China, live under repressive regimes like this. During those years that I traveled, my students would love to hear stories about my childhood on the prairies of Western Canada. They knew that my father and mother had 7 children, and at one point, all 7 were following the Lord and involved in ministry. And so they were always curious to know, what did your parents do that all 7 of their children grabbed that baton of faith and ran with it? When I taught about disciple making, passing faith to the next generation, I often used that image of a relay race, the picture of passing the baton of faith to someone following in the race. When I told my students that my mother and father had raised 7 children, all of whom grew up to love God, they would often ask me, how did they do it? How did they pass the life of faith to the next generation, to your generation, in such a way that all 7 children grabbed the baton and ran with it? They wanted to know how faith was passed successfully. And I really never knew quite how to answer that question. I would ask my mother when I was home on home assignment, and she didn't know what to say. She didn't want to take credit for something that maybe she hadn't done. But after she died, I realized that I had an answer to that question. I think I know now how my parents so successfully passed the legacy of faith to their children. And here's my answer, and I'm announcing it to you this morning. My parents told us their story. They told us their story. My father has been gone now for 51 years, and my mother's been in heaven for 20 years. I can hardly remember their faces, but I remember their stories. And even more significant, I remember so clearly the God of my father and my mother, who was revealed in those stories. The finest investment, the best way that I can suggest to you here at Rockbridge Alliance, the best way I can think of talking about the passing of faith to the coming generation is to tell them your story. I don't care if you are 7 years of age. I know those children are downstairs where someone else is telling them the story. If you're 7 or 17 or 70 or 97, tell them your story. See who's following behind you. Maybe it will be a matter in this church, as Foothills Alliance did, of tapping on the shoulder someone whom you perceive to have gifts that God could use to build his church. There is an Old Testament story of crossing the Jordan River. Do you remember that story in the book of Joshua? And the people of Israel, for 40 years they had been wandering in the desert, and they had buried an entire generation of Israelites who would never see the promised land. Finally, they were ready to go into Canaan. And all that stood between them, all that stood between Israel and the land that God had promised to them, was the Jordan River. But how do you move several million people across a rushing river at its seasonal peak? The story is found in Joshua chapter 3, verses 10, 11. And I invite you to read it with me. It's on the screen here. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites. The ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. As soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. I love that. Water standing up in a heap. That day God did a miracle. It sounded so familiar to the Israelites what God was going to do, because they remembered their parents telling them about what God did with the Red Sea when their grandparents had come out of Egypt. And Scripture tells us that at the moment the feet of the priests touched the river, the water further upstream simply stopped flowing. It was a miracle. And I love how it says at the end of that passage that the water just piled up in a heap, and the priests walked out into the middle of the riverbed. It was bone dry. And there they waited while several million people walked to the other side on dry ground. It's an amazing story. And then God told Joshua to choose 12 men, one from each tribe of Israel, to pick up a big stone out of the middle of the riverbed, boulders that had been under the surface of the water. They were now exposed by this miraculous piling up of the waters. They must have been big stones because they carried them out of the riverbed on their shoulders. And the men carried those stones to the other side of the river and set them down in the promised land. Those big stones were stacked in one enormous pile. They were to become a memorial, a marker of the very place where God had shown his power over the Jordan River. Why the pile of stones? Why did God tell Joshua to make a memorial with stones? Joshua was to do this so that in the years that followed, the children would see that pile of stones. And they would ask their parents, they would say, "Hey, Mom, hey, Grandpa, hey, Dad, what do those stones mean?" God knew they would ask because that's what kids do. And God said, one day your children will ask you, what do those stones mean? He said, tell them your story. That's how faith is passed from one generation to another. That pile of stones became a platform from which amazing stories of God's faithfulness would be told. And that's why I tell my stories. That's why I felt such a burden to get those miraculous stories from those years in Eastern Europe and Russia. That's why I wrote the book. And that's why my mother and father were so committed to telling us their stories, because every time a story is told, whether it was to me and my 6 siblings or to the readers of my book, the listener begins to formulate a response to 3 important questions. And here are the 3 questions. Who is God? Who am I? And what is my purpose in life? Think with me about that and tell me if I'm not correct. Can you picture my father with his 7 children around him, perhaps at bedtime, telling his stories about his own childhood in China? We loved those stories. He could tell us those stories over and over and over, and we never got tired of them. I will admit that no stories made us laugh more than his first-person accounts of what a naughty little boy he was. We loved the stories where our father talked about how he disobeyed and was punished by his parents. We loved those stories, and as we listened, our own personal answers to those 3 questions I've put before you were forming in our minds. The first question, who am I? As we listened to my father, a question was forming. It was forming in our own minds. How could our father, our daddy, be such a naughty little boy? How could he be so sinful? And yet we knew that God loved him. And we began to understand that God chose him to be a child in spite of his sin. God didn't choose him because he was perfect or because he never sinned. God chose my father to be his child because that's what God does. He loves us in spite of our brokenness. And with amazing transparency, my father would tell us not just his successes. He told us at times of how he really blew it. We saw his own sinfulness, and we began to understand our own sinfulness. And then as time went on, I began to understand the words of Scripture. God chose Israel, not because of anything inherently good in them, but just because he loved them. And he wanted to use them to accomplish his purposes in history. And as we listened to our parents' stories, we began to understand the answers to that question, who am I? I saw myself as a sinful child, and yet I knew myself to be so deeply loved by God. The second question, who is God? In my father's stories of his naughtiness and his confession of sin and his simple trust in God, I began to see what God is really like. And I came to know personally a God of love. I saw that God was merciful and forgiving and faithful. Our stories reveal to our listeners what God is like. I say this to young people whom I'm discipling as I encourage them to tell me their stories. I encourage them to tell their stories to the children in the church, for example. I tell them, your stories help your listeners get a grasp, get an understanding of who God is. And I will say to you this morning that as I grew up, I began to fall in love with the God of my father and my mother, because the stories of my father and my mother pointed to Jesus. Which takes me to that third question, what is my purpose in life? What about that third question? As I have traveled across the country for the last 2.5 months, I have encountered so many young people who are desperately searching for the answer to that question. Why am I here? Why did God create me? What is my purpose in life? And as I think about the stories that my mother and father told, I don't think they realized it, but their children, we children who were listening, were beginning to formulate our own answers to that question. We began with emerging clarity to understand why we'd been born. And you know, our stories do that. I want to encourage you. You each have a story to tell, and they will help your listeners to answer those nagging questions of why God created us. And the God of biblical faith, he answers, I want you to know me. I want you to know the Father. And you will know me by the things I've done. That was the whole point of that memorial that Joshua encouraged Israel to build on the banks of the Jordan River. And as we grow in intimacy with God, we come to know ourselves as deeply loved by God. And we discover our calling. For me, my calling was discerned through the church. And I pray that this church will have a role. Those of you who are in the older generations, look around. Every time you encounter a young person who's doing something worthy, something little, using some spiritual gift, affirm that in them. That is the legacy that you can invest in the next generation. That is the legacy my mother and father left in their children. And as I was writing my book, and I do hope you'll buy one and take it with you today, it is a book about passing faith to the next generation. The importance of leaving a legacy, because my reason in writing was to tell readers here in Canada that we all have a story to tell. Here's one of the stories, and I'm moving to the end of this message. Here's one of the stories that's in the book and that demonstrates another way of passing faith to the next generation. But it includes telling stories, and I taught so many of the women in Romania during the communist years how to tell stories, how to think back on their lives and recreate it into a good story to tell to the next generation. Just before COVID wiped out travel for most of us, I had the chance to go back to Romania and interview many, many of the people that I had worked with during those years. I needed to go back just to validate my memories. I think I already told you that. Let me tell you about one of those stories from that trip. This actually happened on that trip that I made in 2018. When my former students found out that I was coming back to visit, they were so excited. And they began to plan an evening gathering, and they invited 300 women to come to a big hall in the Hotel Imperial in Oradea, western Romania. They wanted me to speak, and the woman organizing it, I think her picture will be on the screen, a picture of Viorica. She had invited 300 women, and she told me, these are my disciples. Now, you might be saying, how could one woman have discipled 300 women? All 300 of those women had one thing in common. They were disciples of this simple, uneducated woman named Viorica. And the night of the conference arrived. It was November 2019. I arrived at the hotel early because I knew that parking would be at a minimum. So very quickly I realized I was thinking about who might be there. 300 of Viorica's disciples. And I realized suddenly, these were my fourth generation of women. Let me explain, because that might be language you're not familiar with. Viorica was discipled by a woman named Ica during the 1990s. That was after the revolution in Romania, and the church in Romania was free. But Ica had been discipled by Nicoleta during the late 80s, when communism, the regime of Nicolae Ceausescu, was still persecuting the church. Nicoleta had been discipled by me. As I got up to speak that night, and my translator beside me, Emma, stood up, I had this flashback to a memory of 36 years before that. I was in Bucharest, Romania. This was during the communist years in the early 80s, in 1983. And I was meeting with pastors in the underground church. If you want to know the nail-biting story of how I got to that meeting with this secret group, you have to read the book. Usually we would wait on the town square and wait for someone who we had never met before who would lead us to, again, with a prearranged sign to where the believers were meeting. So here I was now in a tiny, hidden room at the back of the church, a little church on Poparusa Street in Bucharest. I was meeting with 6 pastors. I thought I was coming to Romania to join the faculty of this underground seminary, but it didn't take me just a few minutes to realize that these men would never receive teaching from a woman. There was no way this was going to work. The idea even of training women to serve the church, remember this was 40 years ago. This was a new idea to the men. They couldn't believe, when I suggested, I said, well, if you can't receive teaching from me as a woman, maybe I can teach your wives. And the men were taken aback because the idea of training women in those days in the church had no role at all, except to bear children and to pray for their husbands who were pastors. And what I was proposing to them was even somewhat dangerous, because the more people who got into a training program, the more chances there were that the secret police would discover that what was happening behind closed doors in those secret places. So the pastors were trying to wrap their minds around the idea of training women. It was a crazy idea. And I asked the men to allow me to invest in their wives. They sat in stunned silence as they thought about what I was proposing. And finally, it was the father of Emma, this woman translating for me. It was the father of Emma who leaned into the circle of pastors, and his statement was, Miriam, train women? You can't. They talk too much. They laughed, you laugh, but I tell you today the women are not laughing, because that night in the Hotel Imperial in 2019, I met with 300 women who were the 4th generation of students. Back in the day in 1983, I tore a piece of paper from my notebook and I drew the diagram that you see on the screen. It was a diagram of 2 Timothy 2:2, and I drew Paul's name at the very center. Paul had several disciples, Timothy, Silas, Barnabas, John Mark, and Paul said to his disciple Timothy, he said, the things I teach you, teach to others, who in turn will be able to teach others. It was the only way we could train the church in a day when the church was under persecution. And then I drew another diagram, but this time I drew a circle with my name at the center and 6 spokes leading outward. And into each of the circles, I wrote the names of one of those pastors' wives. And going around the table, I asked each man, I would ask his wife's name, and would he allow his wife to be trained? The men were terrified, but one at a time, the men would raise their hand, give me their wife's name, committing themselves and their wife to being trained for Christian ministry in the church. I reminded them what 2 Timothy 2:2 is about. Their wives would be my 2nd generation. And as Paul said to Timothy, the 2nd generation would teach the 3rd generation. And the 3rd generation would teach the 4th generation. Can you catch why I called the book Regeneration? And among my 1st generation women was a woman named Nicoletta. She was terrified at the idea that she could teach. And I told them, I explained teaching in terms of storytelling. Tell them the story, your story, the stories of Scripture. And she didn't want to believe that she could teach. But if she wanted to stay in the group, she was required to gather around herself the second generation and teach them everything I taught her. And Nicoletta did that. And she gathered around herself a small group of women. Ika was in that group, and Ika gathered around herself another group, and Viorica, who was the host in the Hotel Imperial, Viorica was her in her fourth generation group. Viorica has now led 59 fourth generation groups, and the legacy continues to be passed along now 35, 45 years later, and hundreds of women have been discipled in Romania. And when I was in Romania talking to pastors in 2019, the pastors said to me, Miriam, we look to the women's ministry for encouragement in the men's ministry. The biblical story has a sobering conclusion. As the story of Joshua the leader fades from biblical history, there's a sobering conclusion to the story. Joshua's generation died out, and the next generation did not have the personal knowledge of God. Parents forgot to tell the stories of what God had done for them. Moses had been so good at telling the story. Joshua had been so good at telling the story. That pile of stones, that memorial probably had disintegrated. And the children no longer pointed to it and said, what do those stones mean? And in Judges 2:10, there is this sobering conclusion to the story. It says, after that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. It's such a sad ending. The image for me is one of a dropped baton. The passing of faith was aborted. And I don't want to end on that negative voice here this morning. As I close, I want to pray for you here at Rockbridge, that God will show you clearly how you can be involved in passing faith to the next generation. Maybe God will allow you to gather a group around you to whom you can pass whatever it is you are learning as a follower of Jesus. Will you pray with me as we close? Psalm 78 says, we will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, so the next generation will know them, and they in turn will tell their children. I pray for you this morning. I'm going to pray a prayer of benediction after we sing the next song, that God will lay on your heart who it is you can tell your story to. And if you are in that younger generation, the receiving generation, I plead with you to receive the stories of God's goodness and tell your own story to the generation that follows you. In the name of Jesus.